There, on the cracked concrete of a Buffalo side street, a man was seconds from losing consciousness, and the only person trying to save him was a police officer stepping between him and her fellow cop. A life was preserved that day, but a career was taken apart piece by piece. Officer Cariol Horne had been on the job long enough to recognize danger before it fully formed. The morning was cold, the kind that sharpened every sound and made the city feel older than it already was. Buffalo's east side sat grey and worn, its houses leaning toward the street like tired witnesses who had seen too much. Patrol radios murmured in the background, a constant blend of unit numbers, cross streets, and the occasional spike of urgency. She drove with the window cracked just enough for the air to sting her face. This was a neighborhood she knew by heart. She knew which corners gathered trouble after dark, which porches were still swept clean every morning by people who refused to give up on their block, which vacant houses were more rumor than home. Years of walking these streets had given her a map that lived under her skin. The call that brought her there did not sound special. A disturbance, a struggle, a suspect reportedly resisting. It slotted itself into the radio traffic like any other incident, just another case number waiting to be typed into a report. Nothing in the dispatcher's voice hinted that this call would follow her for the rest of her life. When she turned the corner and saw the flashing lights bouncing off the chipped paint of old houses, it felt like every other response. A small cluster of neighbors stood back from the scene, arms folded, shoulders hunched. No one wanted to be close, but no one could look away. The patrol car, already on scene, sat at an angle, door hanging half open. Then she saw the man on the ground, near a chain-linked fence. A handcuffed man lay face down, his cheek pressed into broken pavement. Gravel and dust had already rubbed his skin raw. A larger officer, someone she knew, someone whose name she had called on a radio more than once, was on top of him. Not in a standard hold to keep a struggling suspect from kicking or rolling, but higher, twisted, his arm locked around the man's neck area in a way that made her stomach drop. The man's legs moved and scattered, weak kicks against the curb. His shoulders, his voice came out in a thin, damaged sound that barely carried through the cold air. He said he couldn't catch his breath. She heard it clearly. There was no drama in it, no sarcasm, none of the exaggerated complaints officers sometimes joked about in locker rooms. It was the voice of a body running out of air. She had heard a similar sound before from injured people at crime scenes, from accident victims trying to pull air through hurt lungs. It was the sound that made medics hurry. For half a second, she waited. Training lived in her bones. Officers were told not to rush into another officer's use of force without understanding the full picture. People on the ground sometimes shouted things that weren't true. Situations could flip quickly. She watched for any sign that her colleague would shift his grip, adjust his weight, recognize what was happening under him. He didn't. The man's face darkened. His movements grew weaker. The line between restraint and real harm was being crossed in front of her, and there was no time left to debate policy or rank. She crossed the distance and stepped into the space. No one was supposed to enter. Her hands went to her fellow officer, not to assist, but to pull him away from the man's neck area. It was not a gentle touch, not a quiet suggestion at the edge of the scene. It was a direct, forceful action driven by one urgent calculation. If she did nothing, the man on the ground might not get up at all. For a moment, everything froze. The man on the pavement sucked in air in ragged gulps, his body struggling to recover from the sudden shortage. The circle of neighbors watched with wide eyes. Her colleague spun toward her, shock flashing across his face, quickly chased by something harder. In that frozen second, the invisible line she had just crossed became real in everyone's mind. She had put her hands on another officer. In the culture she worked in, few actions were more serious. The man on the ground coughed, air scratching its way back into his lungs. The worst outcome, the one she had seen in her mind, the one that had propelled her forward, had been avoided. But as she stood there, heart pounding, she felt the weight of what her decision meant pressing against the inside of her chest. The immediate crisis was over. The long-term fallout was only just beginning in the days that followed. The official version of that morning began to take shape, not out on the sidewalk, but inside offices and hallways built of concrete and fluorescent light. On paper, the reports described a combative suspect, a tense situation, officers acting under pressure. The dangerous hold that had cut off the man's air became just one detail among many. What stood out instead, in certain lines and phrases, was her intervention. Words like interfered, compromised, safety, and disrupted control of the suspect appeared. In drafts and notes, in the informal network of conversations that carried more weight than paperwork ever did. The story was even harsher. She had chosen the suspect over her fellow officer. She had embarrassed him in front of civilians. She had stepped out of line. The same uniform that was supposed to bind them together now marked her as someone who had broken an unwritten rule. She felt it the next time she walked into the precinct. The way conversations thinned when she approached. The way some officers looked past her as if she wasn't there. The way others watched her too closely, as if calculating how far her disloyalty might spread. Internal affairs called her in. The interview room was plain, the kind of space designed to make people feel small. A table, 2 chairs, a recorder between them. Questions landed with a polite, professional edge that did nothing to disguise their purpose. Why did you touch him? Why didn't you wait for a supervisor? Why did you believe your judgment was better in that moment? She explained what she saw. The man's color, the sound of his breath, the placement of the other officer's arm, the timing, the split-second window in which a decision had to be made. She described the calculations she had done without words, honed from years of seeing what bodies could and could not survive. The investigators listened, nodded, wrote things down. But she could feel, in the slight pauses and sideways glances, where their attention truly rested, not on the almost loss of life, but on her deviation from the expected script. The man on the ground had gone home that day. She went home under a cloud. Suspension arrived in the language of formal notices and policy citations. Her badge was turned in, her access revoked. The place she had walked into for years as part of a team now treated her as an outsider, who needed to be kept at a distance. A paycheck stopped. The rest of life did not dot at home. Bills still arrived, with their indifferent due dates. Children still needed food, clothes, school supplies. The leaks in the roof still dripped when it rained. Her family's worry, at first an undercurrent, grew more present as the months passed. She had once told her children that wearing the uniform meant doing the right thing even when it was hard. Now she had to explain why doing the right thing had pushed her out of that uniform. They asked questions that no policy manual could answer. Would they have to move? Would she ever go back to work? Had she really done something wrong? Each question cut more deeply than the last. She tried to answer with honesty, but honesty did not pay utility bills or fix the hollow feeling that came from losing both a job and a sense of belonging. Inside the department, her case dragged on. Hearings were scheduled and rescheduled. Statements were taken, compared, and weighed. Each step felt like another attempt to reshape what had happened that morning into something more manageable, something that posed less of a challenge to the system itself. Over time, the focus shifted further away from the man who had nearly lost consciousness and more solidly onto her. She was no longer simply an officer who had intervened in a dangerous situation. She was a problem to be managed. The termination letter, when it finally came, was precise and cold. It cited internal rules and alleged failures. It arrived just before she would have secured the full pension that officers counted on after years of service. The timing was not an accident. Her badge, once a symbol of purpose, was now an object she had to surrender. She placed it on a desk in an office that felt suddenly unfamiliar. The supervisor who accepted it did so with professional distance, eyes skimming past her rather than resting on her face. There were no speeches, no farewells, no acknowledgement that she had spent years walking into situations other people ran away from. She walked out of the building with empty hands. The city outside looked the same. Same cracked sidewalks, same traffic lights, same bus stops where people huddled in the cold. But her place in it had shifted. She was no longer the person citizens might call in an emergency. She was a cautionary tale whispered in break rooms. At first, she tried to put distance between herself and the incident. She focused on survival, finding ways to keep the household afloat, supporting her children through their confusion and worry, dealing with the daily sting of running into people who had heard only one version of her story. But the memory of that morning would not fade. Whenever she tried to move on, the image of the man on the ground came back. His face pressed to concrete, his voice thinning. The moment when his breathing almost stopped. She asked herself, more than once, what would have happened if she had stayed back. If she had decided that the cost was too high, that stepping in wasn't worth it. The answer followed quickly and relentlessly. Someone could have lost his life while she watched. No job, no pension, no internal rule could make that outcome acceptable to her. So she began to speak it first. It was in small spaces, church basements, community meetings, gatherings organized by people who already distrusted official versions of events. She told what she had seen and what it had cost her to act on it. Her voice was calm, not theatrical. She did not try to turn herself into a legend. She talked about the weight of decisions made in a few seconds and paid for over years. She talked about the pressure inside the department to look away when colleagues stepped too far. She talked about the quiet rule that said loyalty flowed one way from officers toward the institution and rarely in reverse. Her story moved slowly at first. A local news piece, a mention in a community newsletter, a clip shared online. People who had long suspected that there was something deeply wrong with how certain incidents were handled listened and nodded. Her experience fit too neatly into patterns they already recognized. Beyond her city, similar stories were unfolding. In other states, other officers faced their own split-second choices when they saw colleagues use force that crossed a line. Some stayed silent. Some spoke up. Those who intervened often found themselves isolated, disciplined, or pushed out. The pattern was clear to those willing to look. Systems built to manage public safety were not built to protect those inside who refused to go along with wrongdoing. Years passed. Other cases of publicly recorded force spread across the country. Videos captured what had once only been heard about in fragments and rumors. People watched as individuals on the ground begged for air, cried out, or fell still. The phrases used in these recordings echoed phrases she remembered from that morning on the cracked street, when one particular video of a man on the pavement under an officer's weight traveled around the world. The words he repeated cut deep into the public conscience. People marched, shouted, held signs, and demanded change. Policies that had once been defended as necessary began to look indefensible under the harsh light of replayed footage. For her, that moment was not a revelation. It was a confirmation of what she had known for years, that what nearly happened on her shift had happened, in full view and with no intervention, somewhere else suddenly. People were interested in officers who had tried to step in and been punished for it. Her name began to surface in conversations she was not part of. Activists and lawyers mentioned her case as an example of why simply telling officers to intervene was not enough if doing so ended their careers. In Buffalo, pressure built on local leaders. It was no longer enough to say that the past was unfortunate but settled. The wider movement for accountability forced a reconsideration of cases that had once been quietly closed. Community members who had heard her speak now had a broader language to frame what happened to her. They did not just see it as one person's misfortune. They saw it as evidence of a system that punished the wrong people. Discussions began about a new type of rule, one that would not only require officers to step in when a colleague used clearly excessive force, but that would protect those who did. A law that would turn what she had done once, treated as misconduct, into a recognized duty. The proposal carried her name. The idea felt strange to her at first. For years, that name had been associated mostly with loss of a job, of income, of trust from people she once worked beside. Now it was attached to something that might prevent others from going through the same isolation. Debates were held in council chambers. Legal language was drafted, revised, and argued over. Officials spoke about encouraging a culture where officers were expected to look out not just for each other, but for the people in their custody. Advocates pointed out that culture could not shift if those who acted with conscience were left unprotected. Finally, the law passed. It said, in its careful phrasing, that officers had an obligation to intervene when they saw another officer using clearly excessive force. It also said, with equal care, that those who intervened could not be retaliated against for doing so. On paper, it was a set of obligations and protections. In practice, it was an acknowledgement of what had gone wrong in her case. It did not erase the years she had spent in the wilderness without a badge, without a steady income, carrying the quiet stress of not knowing if the next month's bills could be paid. It did not refund the nights spent staring at the ceiling, replaying decisions and wondering whether telling the truth had been worth the cost, but it validated the line she had refused to cross. The line where silence becomes complicity. Her legal fight continued alongside the legislative change. She wanted more than a law bearing her name. She wanted her record corrected and the official narrative rewritten to match what had truly happened. The courtroom, where her case returned, felt different from the internal hearing rooms she had sat in years earlier. There, the questions had been framed by department priorities. Here, at least in theory, the questions were framed by a larger concept of justice. Evidence was reviewed. The incident was examined not as an inconvenience to the department, but as a moment when a life had been endangered and then preserved. The timing of her termination was studied, including its proximity to her pension milestone. Statements about her supposed misconduct were weighed against the reality of a man regaining his breath after her intervention. The judge spoke with measured calm, but his words carried weight that cut through years of distortion. He recognized that she had acted to prevent serious harm. He recognized that she had been punished, not for endangering anyone, but for disrupting a pattern that too often went unchallenged. He recognized that the outcome, saved life, should never have led to the stripping away of her career and security. He overturned what had been done to her. Her pension was restored. Her record adjusted. Officially, she was no longer the officer pushed out in disgrace, but someone who had been wronged. The decision did not suddenly make everything right. The years lost could not be returned. The trust broken between her and people she had once considered colleagues could not be easily repaired. But the ruling stood as a formal statement that the system, in her case, had failed its own stated values. Outside the courthouse, a small group of supporters waited. There were no marching bands, no grand celebrations, no national broadcast. Just people who had followed her story and believed that what happened to her mattered. Beyond one person's life, reporters asked questions. How did she feel? Did the ruling make up for what she had endured? What did she want officers in other cities to learn from her experience? She answered, as she always had, without dramatics, without rehearsed slogans. She spoke about the importance of acting when confronted with clear danger, about the necessity of rules that matched the moral reality on the ground, and about the fact that no one should have to choose between keeping a job and stopping obvious harm years. After that morning on the cracked concrete, she still sometimes drove through the old neighborhood. The houses were just as worn. Some had new paint. Others were boarded up. Children played on sidewalks where she had once responded to calls. People waited at bus stops, carrying bags and worries and quiet hopes. She did not always stop near the spot where everything changed. When she did, there was nothing to mark it. No plaque, no painted line, no sign to explain that on this piece of sidewalk. A choice had been made that would ripple through policies and courtrooms and late-night conversations in living rooms across the city. But she knew, she remembered the feel of the air in her lungs as she rushed forward. She remembered the sound of the man pulling in breath after her hands moved her colleague away. She remembered the way the silence around her changed from shock to anger, from gratitude to suspicion. If she had to choose again, she knew what she would do. The cost had been high. The years had been hard. The label of troublemaker had followed her through more rooms than she could count. But every time she pictured the alternative, the stillness of a body that never got back up, the knowledge that she had stood by while that happened, the scales tilted back in favor of the choice she made in quiet moments. She thought about officers she would never meet, in cities she would never visit, standing in their own small circles of decision, maybe at a traffic stop, maybe in a hallway of a housing project, maybe in the back of a patrol car where a suspect's voice had started to sound wrong. She hoped that, when those officers felt the same tension she had felt between staying back and stepping in, they would remember that there was now a rule, a law, a story carrying her name that said clearly, you were expected to act, and if they feared the cost. She hoped they would also remember the deeper truth she had learned and paid for over years. You are not the problem for refusing to watch harm continue. The real problem is any system that punishes you for stopping it. In the years that followed her legal victory, her life settled into a different kind of rhythm. There were no more roll calls, No more early morning uniform inspections. No more radio calls jolting her into motion. Instead, her days were marked by invitations to speak, by quiet drives to schools and community centers, by evenings spent at kitchen tables with people who wanted to understand how things could go so wrong inside a system that claimed to protect them. New recruits at academies sometimes found her in their curriculum not as a name in a footnote, but as a case study. In some classrooms, instructors showed slides with summaries of what had happened on that cold Buffalo street. They talked about duty to intervene, about the meaning of professional courage, about the cost of staying silent. In other classrooms, younger officers sought her out on their own, finding her story online and listening to interviews, where she spoke slowly and clearly about that morning when she met those recruits in person. She saw in them the same mix she had once carried: idealism, wariness, and an uneasiness they could not yet name. She didn't lecture them. She simply described what it felt like to stand at the edge of a moment where everyone expected you to do one thing, and your conscience insisted you do another. Some nodded silently. Some asked questions about procedures, about policies, about whether the new laws would really protect them if they ever had to make a similar choice. She never promised them safety. She only promised that doing nothing in the face of obvious harm would stay with them longer than any disciplinary letter outside of training rooms. Community groups invited her to panels that were often tense mixtures of anger, fatigue, and fragile hope. Some people in those meetings carried memories of their own encounters with officers who had not listened, not believed them, or not treated them as fully human. Others came because they believed reform was possible and wanted proof that someone inside the system had tried. She understood their skepticism. She had seen firsthand how slow institutions were to admit mistakes and how quickly they rallied around their own. But she also believed that change, when it came, was built from stories like hers, stories that refused to disappear, that forced themselves into official records. That made it harder for future leaders to pretend they didn't know. There were still difficult days. Headlines about new incidents in other cities, in other states, could reopen old wounds. Each new video of an encounter gone wrong, each new name chanted in streets, reminded her of how fragile progress could be. Sometimes she turned off the television and sat in silence, willing herself not to spiral back into the anger and grief that had once threatened to swallow her whole. Yet there were also moments that felt quietly, stubbornly hopeful. Now and then, she received messages from people she had never met. Some were from former detainees, who remembered officers stepping in to de-escalate a situation, and who wondered if those officers had been influenced by hearing her story. Others were from young officers themselves, who wrote late-night emails, confessing that they had faced their own difficult moments and had chosen to act even when it meant stepping in front of a colleague's decisions. They did not name the people involved. They did not provide dates or case numbers. They simply said, "I thought of what you did. I decided I couldn't look away." And then they thanked her. She kept those messages in a folder, both physical and digital, not as trophies, but as reminders that the cost she had paid was not contained to her alone. It had created space, narrow but real, for others to move differently. Her own family slowly rebuilt a sense of steadiness. The children who had once worried about losing their home grew into adults who understood more fully what their mother had carried. They had watched her absorb pressure most of their peers would never see. They had seen bills balanced on thin margins. They had seen her return again and again to the same answer when asked if she regretted intervening. They knew her story not as something told on a screen, but as something that had shaped the texture of their daily lives. What groceries were bought, which clothes were new and which were patched, how often tension filled the house late at night. And they saw, slowly, how that long season of strain had turned into a different kind of strength. On certain anniversaries, the morning air felt heavier. She would wake with the sense that a date on the calendar had weight, even before she checked it. She did not commemorate the day with grand gestures. Sometimes she simply drove through the streets in quiet, letting the city speak to her in familiar sounds and worn-out corners. The spot where it all began remained unmarked. Cars rolled past without slowing. Children cut across the sidewalk on their way to school. A delivery truck might idle there for a few minutes. Driver unaware of what had once happened on that patch of concrete. She preferred it that way. If there had been a monument, it might have turned the story into something too distant, too self-contained. For her, the power of that morning lay not in being frozen in bronze, but in living on as a decision any person might face in their own way, to step in, or to look away. When people introduced her at events, they often emphasized the dramatic parts, the life saved, the career lost, the law named after her, the eventual court victory. She listened patiently, but in her own mind. The story was simpler and more stubborn. It was about a moment when a human being needed help, and she happened to be the one standing close enough to act. Everything else, the hearings, the headlines, the law, the speeches, was a long echo of that choice. In the end, what mattered most to her was not whether people called her a hero or a problem, a symbol or a survivor. What mattered was whether someone, somewhere, hearing what she had lived through, would feel less alone the next time. They stood at a similar crossroads, because if there was one thing her journey had made clear, it was this: systems can change their policies, rewrite their manuals, and revise their training slides, but the real shift happens in the quiet space inside a person's chest, in the heartbeat of a decision where doing the right thing feels dangerous and they do it anyway.